It began like any other policy forum: bright lights, a carefully arranged panel, and the low murmur of an audience filled with aides, journalists, and political watchers waiting for sparks. Ron DeSantis walked in with his usual crisp composure, shaking hands, greeting supporters, and taking his seat with the look of a man confident in his talking points. He had done this routine countless times before: deliver his message, challenge his opponents, and walk away with the upper hand. But this time, across from him, sat Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman known not just for her words, but for her unshakable precision in delivering them. The topic on the agenda was criminal justice reform and the accountability of state leadership in enforcing equal protection under the law. It was the kind of topic that naturally drew strong opinions in for DeSantis' discomfort. Crockett had just begun to speak, laying out a detailed account of disparities in policing practices, particularly in southern states. Her tone was deliberate, informed, and calm, drawing on data rather than emotion. The audience was listening closely, but DeSantis appeared restless, tapping his fingers on the table, occasionally glancing at his notes. As she continued, mentioning how certain state policies perpetuated racial bias in sentencing and arrests. DeSantis' patience seemed too thin. He leaned forward slightly, signaling that interruption was coming. When Crockett referenced a Florida case involving a disproportionate use of force against minority residents, DeSantis cut in mid-sentence. You always make it about race, he said, his voice laced with irritation and condescension. The microphone picked up every word, making sure the remark landed beyond the stage. He smirked, as if expecting laughter or agreement. Maybe if you spent less time playing victim and more time actually working, we'd see progress. The effect was immediate. The audience fell silent. Some shifted uncomfortably, others widened their eyes, unsure if they had heard correctly. It wasn't just an interruption, it was an insult wrapped in arrogance. For a few seconds, the sound of the air conditioning was louder than anything else in the room. Crockett didn't flinch. Her expression didn't change, though the stillness around her said everything. She adjusted the microphone with deliberate care, the kind of pause that draws attention without effort. She didn't raise her voice, didn't rush to defend herself. She simply looked at him, the kind of look that carried weight far heavier than words. DeSantis sat back, as if satisfied that he had thrown her off balance. But what he didn't realize was that he had just opened a door she was fully prepared to walk through. Every person watching, both in the audience and behind the cameras, felt that shift, the kind that happens right before someone turns a careless jab into a revelation. Even before she spoke, the atmosphere had changed. DeSantis' words had exposed something unspoken about how power is often used, not to engage, but to diminish. And the silence that followed wasn't hesitation on her part. It was strategy. It was the kind of silence that forces people to confront what they just heard. DeSantis tried to fill it with a nervous chuckle, perhaps to downplay his own comment, but it only made the room feel smaller. The moderators, unsure whether to step in, exchanged glances but stayed quiet. They knew what was coming, didn't need interruption. When Crockett finally began to respond, her tone was measured. Her words weren't loud, but they carried the clarity of someone who knew the importance of restraint. She didn't shout back, didn't accuse, didn't give him the drama he might have expected. Instead, she let his own words define him, allowing the weight of his insult to settle fully before she dismantled it. That brief exchange, those few seconds of interruption and silence, set the tone for everything that followed. DeSantis had underestimated the gravity of speaking carelessly to someone who understood both the policy and the personal stakes behind it. He thought he was challenging a politician. Instead, he exposed the dismissive pattern that many had long criticized in his approach to governance. Behind the cameras, journalists scribbled notes furiously. They knew they had caught something significant, not because it was explosive, but because it revealed more than either participant intended. The governor's attempt to dismiss Crockett as playing the race card wasn't just an offhand remark, it became a mirror reflecting his own discomfort with accountability. In that moment, DeSantis wasn't the confident figure who had mastered public appearances. He was a man who had lost command of the room without realizing it. The interruption, meant to silence, instead, gave Crockett a platform she didn't have to fight for. Every second of that exchange became a study in power dynamics, in how arrogance can collapse under the quiet strength of composure, and while the cameras kept rolling. Everyone watching, both in the audience and later online, could feel it. A shift that was subtle but irreversible. DeSantis had spoken first, but it was clear that when Crockett finally chose to speak again, the real conversation would begin. When Jasmine Crockett finally began to respond, she didn't rush. Her pause had purpose. It allowed the audience to sit with the discomfort of what had just been said. Then, with the calm authority of someone who had dealt with far worse, she leaned slightly toward the microphone. Her voice was steady, unshaken. She didn't match Ron DeSantis' tone or his impatience. Instead, she met it with precision. Governor DeSantis, she began, her tone polite but firm. You say I make it about race. But when a system continues to disadvantage people based on the color of their skin, pretending it's not about race doesn't make the problem go away. It just protects those who benefit from the silence. Her words were simple, but they landed with the weight of truth. The audience stayed quiet, drawn in by the contrast between his dismissiveness and her control. DeSantis, still seated across from her, folded his hands as if bracing for what was coming next. He'd expected her to react emotionally, perhaps even lose composure, but instead, she went straight to the facts. She began listing the statistics, racial disparities in arrests, sentencing, and police encounters in Florida under his administration. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't embellish. Each example came with data and source, deliberate and unshakable. Florida leads the nation in wrongful convictions of black men, she said, glancing briefly toward him. That's not rhetoric, Governor, that's your record. The moderators looked uneasy, but she kept going, walking a fine line between calm and conviction. When you ban AP African American studies in your schools, when you threaten funding for diversity programs at universities, you're not creating equality or erasing context. You're telling an entire generation that their history is optional. DeSantis tried to interrupt again, saying something about curriculum integrity and stopping political indoctrination. But she didn't let the moment slip. She turned slightly toward him, her expression composed, almost sympathetic. It's interesting, she said softly, that you call it indoctrination when students are simply being taught the truth. You can't call it freedom if it only applies to the parts of history that make you comfortable. The audience murmured, some nodding, some whispering. DeSantis pressed his lips together, his confidence thinning under the steady rhythm of her words. He tried to shift the conversation back to law and order, but she anticipated it. Law and order only mean something, she said, if it applies equally to everyone, but when laws are enforced differently depending on race or class. What you're defending isn't order, it's hierarchy. Every sentence seemed to pull away another layer of the image he had built around himself. She wasn't attacking his personality. She was challenging his governance, and because she stayed calm, it gave her words a clarity that anger could never achieve. DeSantis adjusted his posture, looking toward the moderators as if to signal a change in direction, but they stayed silent. It was clear that this was her moment now. Crockett spoke of Floridian teachers being disciplined for discussing racial history, of students being told to avoid certain books, of communities being stripped of the ability to vote after minor legal missteps. Each point was another mirror held up to his administration. Governor, accountability isn't an attack, she said quietly. It's what leadership looks like. You can't govern a state and ignore the people who live in it just because their experiences don't match your narrative. Her words carried no anger, just an unflinching certainty. That calmness made it more difficult for DeSantis to counter her without appearing defensive. He tried, briefly, to dismiss her claims as media-driven exaggerations, but she stopped him with a single question. So the numbers are lying, the cases are fabricated, or is it just easier for you to call them exaggerated than to fix them? That question hung in the air. It wasn't meant to humiliate him. It was meant to reveal what happens when someone in power refuses to listen. And in that silence, people began to understand that this wasn't a debate, it was exposure. Crockett then pivoted, bringing it back to her original point, the systemic issues that demanded reform. She didn't just criticize, she offered a vision of what leadership should look like, one rooted in fairness, representation, and responsibility. Her ability to refocus the discussion after such an insult demonstrated not only discipline but mastery. As she spoke, DeSantis' expression hardened. His usual confidence, the kind that carried him through rallies and press conferences, seemed to falter under the weight of her composure. For once, his typical slogans about wokeness, about freedom, about fighting the left, had no effect. Against her calm facts and moral clarity, they sounded hollow. By the time she finished, the room was still. The moderators hesitated before moving to the next question, as if unsure how to proceed after what had unfolded. DeSantis stared down at his notes, avoiding her gaze. He looked like a man trying to find the next line of his script in a conversation that had already left him behind. What had started as an insult meant to discredit her, ended up revealing exactly what she had been saying all along, that the refusal to face systemic injustice wasn't strength, it was weakness, and she had just shown, with quiet precision, that even the most powerful can be held accountable when truth is spoken without fear. As Jasmine Crockett continued, the rhythm of her words built naturally, not like a speech rehearsed for applause, but like a lawyer methodically presenting a case. Each point had evidence, each pause had purpose. Ron DeSantis, once sitting with a posture of command, began to shift slightly in his chair. The energy that had once surrounded him in debates, the kind that fed off control, was no longer there. Now, the attention was entirely on her, and he couldn't interrupt without making it worse. She began to draw direct examples from his record, not out of hostility, but out of accountability. Let's talk about what happens under your leadership, she said evenly. The voter suppression efforts that have disproportionately targeted black communities, the arrests of returning citizens, people who were told they could vote, only to be handcuffed at their doorsteps. That's not reform, Governor. That's regression. Asterisk, he clenched his jaw, trying to maintain composure, but his eyes flickered toward the cameras. Every word she spoke was being recorded, and he knew clips like this didn't disappear quietly. She went on, mentioning the high-profile case of Florida residents prosecuted under his new election laws, individuals who had been given voter IDs by the state itself. You called that integrity, she said. I call it intimidation. Because when power is used to scare citizens from participating, democracy doesn't survive, it shrinks. Asterisk, the moderators looked uneasy again, glancing toward DeSantis as if to offer him an opening, but he didn't take it. For once, he seemed unsure of where to begin. The familiar talking points about law and order suddenly sounded flimsy against the detailed examples Crockett was laying out. Asterisk, and when it comes to education, she continued, you've made it clear that you don't want students to learn about systemic inequality, because acknowledging history makes you uncomfortable. You call it stopping indoctrination, but what you're really doing is deciding which parts of history deserve to be told. Asterisk, there was a slight reaction from the crowd, a mix of shock and admiration. Crockett's tone never shifted from calm, but the precision of her words made them sting more deeply than any raised voice could. She looked directly at him when she spoke next. Governor, censorship doesn't protect children. It protects the people who don't want to answer for what history actually says. Asterisk, DeSantis straightened his back, attempting to recover control. We're focused on facts, not activism, he replied tersely. We don't need politics in the classroom. But Crockett didn't let him retreat behind slogans. Asterisk, facts, she repeated softly. Then let's talk about facts. When your administration bans books about Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, and Martin Luther King Jr., those aren't opinions being silenced, those are facts of history. You can rename censorship as curriculum reform all you want, but truth doesn't bend to comfort. Asterisk, that line drew quiet gasps from the audience. It wasn't shouted, it was delivered almost conversationally, and that made it even more cutting. DeSantis tried to speak again, but she continued, her timing impeccable. You talk about protecting children from ideology, but what ideology is more dangerous than one that teaches them ignorance over understanding? Asterisk, he fell silent. His face betrayed irritation, not just because she challenged him, but because she did so without losing composure. His usual tactic, framing opponents as emotional or irrational, didn't work against someone who dismantled arguments with facts and restraint. Asterisk, Crockett shifted slightly in her seat, her tone softening but her words landing even harder. You accuse others of being divisive, she said, but division doesn't begin when someone points out injustice. It begins when leaders like you refuse to acknowledge it. Asterisk, that sentence cut deeper than anything before. It didn't accuse, it revealed. DeSantis knew that the cameras were still rolling, and every second of his silence was being recorded as clearly as her words. Asterisk, the moderators finally intervened, asking if he wanted to respond. He gave a tight smile, then leaned toward the microphone. This is exactly the kind of political theater people are tired of, he said, forcing a small laugh. She's just reading the same script everyone on the left reads. Asterisk, Crockett didn't flinch. She waited until he finished, then replied with calm precision. If accountability feels like theater to you, Governor, maybe it's because you've gotten too comfortable playing the lead. Asterisk, the room reacted, some applause, some stunned silence, but what mattered most was the look on his face. For the first time that evening, he appeared outmatched, not by aggression, but by composure. He tried to hide it behind his usual smirk, but even that faltered. Asterisk, she went on to discuss how leadership demands the courage to face uncomfortable truths. She talked about responsibility, not the performative kind used in press conferences, but the kind that requires empathy, transparency, and self-reflection. Her argument wasn't just political. It was moral. She made it clear that accountability wasn't a partisan demand, it was a human one. Asterisk, as the minutes passed, DeSantis' earlier confidence seemed to erode completely. His responses became shorter, his tone defensive. He tried to pivot to national issues, but she brought it back every time to his record, his policies, his choices. By then, the audience had stopped looking to him for answers. They were watching her, waiting for what she would say next. Asterisk, when she finally paused, the silence was thick. Everyone knew the balance in the room had shifted entirely. DeSantis had walked in expecting to dominate the conversation, but now he sat there, diminished not by insults or outrage, but the moment the exchange ended, the air in the room carried that strange mix of tension and awe that follows a public reckoning. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew something significant had just happened. The moderators quickly shifted to the next topic, eager to regain control of the discussion, but the energy had already changed. Ron DeSantis kept his composure, but it was clear from his tight jaw and the way his fingers drummed to the desk that he wanted to move past it. Yet Jasmine Crockett didn't need to say another word. The moment had already crystallized. Asterisk, what stood out wasn't the insult itself. but how efficiently she dismantled it. No shouting, no theatrics, no grandstanding, just logic, precision, and restraint. In the chaos of modern politics where raised voices and viral outrage often overshadow reason, her calm takedown felt almost radical. The audience, though polite, had begun to sense that they'd witnessed more than a simple exchange of words. It was a shift in power, one that came quietly, but landed deeply. By the time the event concluded, the chatter in the lobby was no longer about the policies discussed, but about that one moment. "Did you see how she handled him?" one attendee murmured. "She didn't even raise her voice." Others nodded, replaying the words in their minds, recalling the look on DeSantis' face when his talking points failed to land. Even some of his own supporters, though unwilling to admit it publicly, couldn't deny that she had caught him off guard in a way few ever had. Within hours, the clip began spreading online. At first it appeared on political news accounts and activist pages, but soon it reached wider audiences. The title that followed the clip across social platforms varied. Crockett Schools, DeSantis gets checked live. Crockett's.com, dismantling goes viral. No matter the headline, the story was the same. Viewers were struck not just by what she said, but by how she said it. People were used to political confrontations being chaotic, full of interruptions and shouting matches. But Crockett's approach was different. Her poise made DeSantis' aggression look desperate. Commentators across the spectrum began dissecting the exchange. Some conservative voices tried to frame it as an overreaction, but the clip itself betrayed that argument. The insult had been clear, and her response had been undeniably measured. Even those who disagreed with her politically admitted that she had outmaneuvered him completely. DeSantis' team tried to control the narrative. They issued statements emphasizing his commitment to education reform and accused the media of twisting his words. But those efforts fell flat. The footage spoke for itself, and his dismissive tone couldn't be edited away. Every attempt to reframe the encounter only drew more attention to it. Meanwhile, Crockett's following grew overnight. Her words were quoted, remixed into speeches, shared in classrooms, and replayed across talk shows. What made it shocking wasn't that she fought back, it was how she did it. She turned what could have been a messy argument into a demonstration of composure under fire. In doing so, she revealed a deeper truth about how leadership should look. DeSantis had relied on dominance. She relied on clarity. He used interruption. She used silence. He aimed for control. She aimed for understanding. And that difference resonated with people far beyond the walls of that event. Journalists noted that DeSantis seemed less confident in his subsequent appearances. During interviews, when asked about the confrontation, he brushed it off, calling it political noise. But even that phrase felt hollow, like an attempt to downplay a moment that had already defined itself. The footage wasn't just a clip anymore, it had become a reference point, replayed whenever discussions of accountability and respect arose. Crockett, for her part, didn't gloat. When asked about it later, she simply said, "I didn't destroy him, I corrected him. There's a difference." That statement alone deepened the contrast between them. Where he had tried to silence, she had sought to clarify. Her restraint became her strength, and that quiet strength was what people remembered most. Even weeks later, DeSantis couldn't fully shake the moment. Every mention of it reminded audiences of how his own arrogance had backfired. His advisors privately admitted that the exchange had hurt him not because it was explosive, but because it revealed something more damaging, his inability to respond to challenge with grace. It wasn't the loss of an argument. It was the loss of composure. Meanwhile, Crockett's stature rose. She was invited to panels, interviews, and news segments, not for her political affiliations, but for the way she embodied control under pressure. She had become a symbol of how intellect could outlast intimidation. DeSantis, who had once prided himself on being unflappable, had met someone who didn't need to shout to be heard louder than him. The power of that moment wasn't in its volume, was in its silence. DeSantis had spoken first, loud and sure of himself, but Crockett had finished stronger, not by overpowering him, but by exposing what power without humility truly looks like. And once people saw that, they couldn't unsee it. In the days that followed, the dust of that confrontation didn't settle, it spread. Clips continued to circulate, think pieces appeared across major outlets, and both sides of the political aisle weighed in. Yet, beneath all the noise, something quieter but more lasting lingered. People weren't talking about another political clash. They were talking about a lesson in composure, integrity, and the quiet strength of refusing to stoop to the level of insult. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended herself. She had exposed something larger about how power behaves when it's challenged. Ron DeSantis had entered the forum confident, perhaps certain that experience and control would carry him through. But what unfolded reminded everyone that preparation and poise can be more powerful than position. The insult, intended to discredit, ended up defining him instead. His words revealed not strength but fragility, the kind that surfaces when someone used to dominance meets someone unwilling to be intimidated. Crockett's response, rooted in calm reasoning rather than emotion, turned the moment into a mirror. reflecting the imbalance of respect and understanding that often shapes political spaces. Asterisk for many watching. It wasn't just a victory for her, it was a reminder that intellect and restraint still have a place in public discourse. The exchange underscored how clarity can pierce louder than aggression, how silence can command more respect than noise. DeSantis' brand of confrontation, so reliant on dismissal and bravado, looked suddenly outdated next to her precision. It was as if, for a brief moment, the political stage had been reset not by force, but by grace under pressure. Asterisk commentators called it a lesson in modern leadership. But for Crockett, it was simply authenticity. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her credibility did that for her. And for DeSantis, the fallout was subtle, yet undeniable. Every future appearance carried the faint echo of that exchange, a reminder that arrogance can't outtalk truth forever. Asterisk in a world where debates often dissolve into noise and outrage. That single moment stood apart because it wasn't about volume. It was about accountability. Crockett had shown that power doesn't belong to those who speak the loudest, but to those who speak with purpose. And that is what audiences carried with them long after the cameras stopped rolling. Asterisk. The encounter between Ron DeSantis and Jasmine Crockett became more than a viral clip, it became a study in contrast. It revealed that when leadership forgets humility, it loses its foundation, and when courage meets disrespect with composure, it redefines strength. In the end, it wasn't just about who won an argument. It was about who upheld dignity in the face of insult, and that, above all,